Hi, I'm Lauren Paradise, one of the reference and instruction librarians. My email is lparadiso1@manhattan.edu if you have any questions. In this video, we'll be talking about how to evaluate the sources that you find. One way that you can classify sources is if they are primary or secondary. A primary source is a direct source. It is something that is written by an eyewitness or participant. It may be an autobiography, interview, policy paper, or a historical newspaper article from a time that you're researching. Additionally, it can be an original research study in a scholarly journal or published by an organization. A secondary source is an indirect source. It analyzes primary source accounts in order to put them into perspective and may also be written by someone outside of an event or significantly afterwards. Primary sources can be used to gather direct information about a topic. Secondary sources can be used to get context, summary, or analysis. For example, if you wanted to know the current regulations for school lunches for your paper, you could check the Department of Education for recent reports. If you wanted an analysis on how those regulations have changed, you'd want a secondary source from a researcher that read lots of primary sources on the topic and can compare them using their subject expertise. Another way you'll want to classify your sources is if they are popular or scholarly. Examples of popular sources are magazines or newspapers, or books from popular presses that are written for an audience of non-experts. These can be more current than scholarly sources, but if it comes at the cost of the information in them being less reliable, you want to limit how often you use them. Examples of scholarly sources are articles from peer-reviewed journals, research from a professional organization, books from a scholarly press, or a study with original research done to the standards of the field it came out in. The reason that the distinction is made between the two is due to the amount of verification an article will go through before it's published in each. If I'm an expert in preschool education and I write an editorial for the Wall Street Journal saying that there is absolutely no negative effect of advertising on children, then the amount of verification it goes through before it is published could just be that they make sure that I don't spell anyone's name wrong, that I don't misquote anyone, and that I don't make any huge factual errors like saying that television was invented in 1982. However, if I'm that same expert and I write an article for a scholarly journal claiming the same thing, then they send it to other experts in preschool education, who may read it first and say, yep, this is fine, but they might also say, hang on a tick, your study doesn't have a control group, or your study contradicts a different recent study. How do you account for the results being so different? And make me refine what claims I make in my article to make it more credible. This is why most of your professors say that you must have a certain number of scholarly sources cited to make arguments for your paper. No matter what kind of source you're using, you'll need to evaluate it for credibility. A device you can use for that is the SMEL test, created by the media policy organization MediaShift. You think of the source, which is whoever wrote and published the work, their motivation, or any biases or incentives they may have to make a certain argument, evidence, or what they are bringing forward to say that their claim is true, logic, how they are analyzing that evidence to come up with whatever verdict they want you to agree with, and finally, left out, what people, events, or arguments they may be leaving out of the picture that they are drawing for you. For source, you want to consider the author's authority over the subject matter and how reliably they have written about it in the past. For a scholarly article, the author or authors' expertise will be mentioned, what their field is, and where they are a professor or what organization they work with. Sometimes in Google Scholar, you can also see what other papers they have written. For a popular source, it will sometimes be at the bottom of an article which publications the author writes for, or any books they may have written. But in other cases, you may have to see if there's a personal website that lists where and what they publish. You try to find this because you want to make sure that whatever the author's expertise is matches what kind of field they are arguing in, and that it is something that they have written about reliably. If you read a paper about climate change being exaggerated, and the author is someone who has a doctorate, But in computer science, that is something that you should be skeptical of unless whatever arguments they are making match the field they have authority in. But you'll also want to get an idea of their motivation. With motivation, you'll want to think about the primary purpose someone has in publishing this article. Is it intended to inform or give bare-bones information? Is it intended to analyze a problem from several angles or very deeply from a certain angle? Or is it intended to persuade? Scholarly articles will often lay out their hypothesis they are testing or their main argument pretty plainly, and some popular articles will too, but all of these will have some element of bias. There is no such thing as complete objectivity. All people writing on a topic have some amount of bias, but responsible writers will let you know what that bias is. They will make clear that their objective with Free School Lunch is about ensuring nutrition rather than educational, economic, or political concerns, or that they are writing this analysis of school prayer from a conservative viewpoint. Your job isn't to find sources totally free of bias, but to take bias into account when deciding what to do with the information and arguments that you get. Remember, just because you agree with something doesn't mean it's not biased. This is an example of a media bias chart put out by a patent attorney running a site called All Generalizations Are False. I'm giving you that information because just because I'm a librarian doesn't mean I shouldn't let you know where I got my information from or how it was analyzed. I'm not 100% in agreement with where each of these publications are placed, but I do like that it gives you a useful framework to put the sources that you find in. You can consider sources from viewpoint, represented as left to right on this chart, in terms of whether they are liberal, centrist, or conservative. You'll also want to consider them as to what kind of article they are, represented with up and down on this chart, whether they are bare bones reporting, analysis, persuasion, or propaganda. At the top of this chart would be original or basic fact reporting, something like, at this press conference today, Mayor de Blasio announced that all school children can no longer be expelled. Here's the reasons he gave. Here's a quote from someone that agrees with it. Here's a statement from someone that disagrees with it. In this area, there will be sources analyzing it from a liberal viewpoint. Here's why we like it, because of economic disparities in punishment. But what about bullying? Here's a bunch of numbers. Or from a conservative viewpoint. Here's the effect of less harsh punishment on young offenders with numbers and graphs. Below that on the chart, you may find sources that do some amount of analysis on a problem, but the primary objective is to persuade the reader to come away with a certain verdict from a liberal or conservative point of view. These articles can be written fairly in terms of portraying the problem and the other side's arguments with accuracy, or unfairly by leaving out portions of the debate or mischaracterizing a problem. Sources can also fall into the category of being outright propaganda, not at all interested in analysis or facts. This is represented on the bottom of the chart. These kind of articles should be avoided unless you have a reason to quote a fringe or uninformed view on your subject. I'm not asking you to accept each publication exactly as it's placed on the chart, but when reading an article or looking at the output of a publication, you should ask yourself, what is its political bias? And what is this article trying to accomplish the most? To report raw information? To analyze it? To persuade me? And if so, is it doing it fairly or unfairly? Another component of motivation is money. Who is funding a project? A scholarly study should state if it has any conflict of interest. For instance, if a certain study says it turns out that dark chocolate is good for your health, but it was funded by the Mars Corporation, then you should look more closely at the evidence presented in the study to see if it is actually credible or just what the researchers were hoping to find for their funder. You need to look closely at the evidence that a source is using to back up its arguments. Say you found an article about a study that claimed that 55% of Americans approve of students with A+s getting free kittens. However, maybe that article doesn't offer up how many people were actually surveyed, what the demographics of the people surveyed were, as in where they lived, what their race, gender, or income were, or how the question was phrased to them. If so, you should try and see if that information is available, and if it is, if that evidence still seems persuasive. You should also take a look at the date of the information that is being quoted in the source and make sure that it is reasonably current to when the article was published. If you read an article from now claiming that internet access is not important to student success, and the study it quotes is from 1993, you'll want to ask yourself why more current information isn't being used in the article and if it can still be trusted. You'll want to make sure that there aren't large holes in the logic of the arguments being used by your source. In the example that I gave earlier of an article that claimed that 55% of Americans approved of students getting free kittens if they get A pluses, if you looked deeper into the numbers behind that 55% and found out that the authors had only surveyed 512 people, most of whom already had cats, then you should question if it's actually logical for them to state that that 55% really applied to all Americans or just the ones that already had cats. This is true for things like charts and graphs too. From this chart, it looks like the two trends being graphed might have something in common with each other. But if I reveal that the numbers being graphed are actually honey-producing bee colonies in the United States and Vermont marriage rates, this evidence isn't enough. I'll still have to come up with a logical argument as to how these two things are related. You'll want to consider not just what is in the article that you are reading, but what is left out of it. No study or article is going to be able to consider something from the point of view of everyone concerned in a problem, but responsible ones will make it clear what they are considering and what they are not. If you're reading an analysis of a problem facing schools from a parental perspective, it may not fully consider the teacher's perspective, and that is why you should seek out that perspective from another article. But sometimes there are items being left out that should make you reconsider if you should trust an article at all. If you found an article about why one school has a musical program and the other does not, and the author talks about student and parental interest in both schools, or if there's noise concerns in the two buildings, but it never mentions whether one school has more funding than the other, then that article is leaving out kind of a big part of the equation, maybe too big for you to trust it. You'll get copies of these links on the slides, but some good fact-checking tools are retractionwatch.com for scientific articles, factcheck.org for political statements, and whois.com and whois.org will help you see what organization might be behind the website you have found while venturing outside the library's resources. So keep the smell test in mind when trying to decide how to use a source in your argument, and also consider what kind of source it is. If you have any questions about how you can apply this to your own research, please feel free to contact us. We're here to help.